I want you to do something before I start this story. I want you to think about the last time you were truly trapped somewhere. Not inconvenienced, not delayed. Trapped where the door is locked from a side you can't control, where the only way out depends entirely on someone else's choice, and you don't know if that choice is coming. Now I want you to imagine that feeling lasting 11 hours. In the dark, with someone else down there with you. Someone who was not supposed to be there. That happened to me on a Tuesday night in May, in a storm cellar under a farmhouse in central Kansas. And I have never told the whole story to anyone until now. Not the police, not my family, not even my wife, who was 3 feet away from me in the dark for most of it. I'm telling you because I finally understand what happened. Took me 4 years. And once you understand it, you'll understand why I couldn't say it out loud until now. Lock the door behind you. This one gets bad. My name is Garrett Voss. I'm 39 years old. My wife Annie and I live on a small farm in McPherson County, Kansas. Flat, open country. The kind of landscape where you can watch weather build from 40 miles away and know exactly how much time you have before it arrives. That's not a casual fact. In Kansas, knowing how much time you have before the weather arrives is the difference between a normal evening and the kind of night that ends up in a story like this one. We'd lived on that farm for 6 years. Annie grew up 40 miles away in a similar kind of place, and she knew tornado season the way some people know their own pulse, which is to say, automatically without thinking about it. I'd grown up in Ohio and had to learn it. Learned it well enough, eventually, that by year 3 I could read a sky the way she could. The storm cellar was original to the property. Built sometime in the 1950s, a concrete bunker about 8 feet by 10 feet, accessed through a slanted steel door set into the ground about 30 feet from the house, connected to nothing else, no tunnel, no secondary exit. Just a hole in the ground with concrete walls, a single bare bulb on a battery pack, 2 cots, some shelving with water and supplies, and the steel door above. We'd used it 4 times in 6 years. Real tornado warnings, the siren going, the sky doing the thing that Kansas skies do when they mean business. Each time we'd gone down, waited it out, come back up to a farm that was fine. The 5th time was different. It was a Tuesday in May, around 9 in the evening. We'd had storms predicted all week. The particular volatile spring pattern that central Kansas gets when warm Gulf air collides with cold fronts coming down from Canada. The atmosphere stacking up energy until it has to discharge it somehow. The forecast had been escalating all day. By late afternoon, the sky had that green-yellow cast that anyone who's lived through Kansas spring learns to take seriously. The tornado warning came at 8:47. Not a watch, a warning, confirmed rotation, tracking toward our county. Annie had the weather radio on, the way she always did during severe weather season. And when the alert came through, she was already moving toward the cellar door before the siren in town even started. I grabbed the dog. She grabbed the emergency bag we kept by the back door, and we went out into the yard. The sky to the southwest was the color of a bruise, and there was a sound, the specific low rumble that isn't quite thunder, that experienced people learn to distinguish from regular thunder, the sound of something rotating. We got the cellar door open and went down the steps, and I pulled the door shut behind us and dropped the interior bar that locked it from the inside. That bar matters. I want you to remember that bar. The cellar was exactly as it always was. Concrete walls, the 2 cots, the shelving, the bare bulb that Annie switched on as soon as we were inside. The dog, a border collie named Pepper, immediately went under one of the cots, which is what she always did, her standard storm behavior. We sat. We listened. Above us, even through 30 inches of compacted earth and concrete, you could hear when a real tornado was close. A sound that doesn't fully translate to people who haven't experienced it. somewhere between a freight train and something tearing. We heard it. For about 4 minutes, the sound built and then was directly overhead and then began to recede. Annie's hand found mine in the dark and held it the way it always did during the worst part. We didn't speak. You don't really during the worst part. You just wait. The sound passed, continued receding. After maybe 10 more minutes, it was gone entirely, replaced by the steady drumming of heavy rain on the cellar door above us. I started to stand up, to go check the bar and head up to assess the damage. And that's when I heard the second sound. Not the storm, something else. From the corner of the cellar that was behind the shelving unit, in the part of the small room that the bare bulb's light didn't fully reach. Breathing. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that makes the rest of this story credible. And I need you to find it credible because I've spent 4 years needing someone to find it credible. It was not Pepper. Pepper was under the cot, visible, panting in the particular shallow way she did during storms, and I could see her clearly. It was not Annie. Annie was sitting next to me, and her breathing was the controlled, steady breathing of someone coming down from adrenaline. It was a third breathing, from the corner behind the shelving. Slow, deliberate, the breathing of someone who knew they were being listened for and was controlling the sound deliberately. I went very still. Annie felt it, the change in my posture, the sudden tension, and she went still too, and I watched her face shift from post-storm exhaustion into something else entirely as she heard it too. We sat in that cellar in complete silence for what felt like several minutes, and the breathing continued from the corner. Steady, patient, not hiding the sound. If it had wanted to hide the sound, it could have held its breath the way you can when you're truly trying not to be heard. This was different. This was breathing that wanted to be noticed eventually on its own schedule. I reached for my phone. No signal. We never had signal in the cellar. The concrete and the depth blocked it completely, which was a known limitation we'd accepted because the cellar's whole purpose was protection, not connectivity. I reached for the flashlight on the shelf. My hand found it in the dark. I knew the cellar well enough to navigate it blind, and I turned it on and pointed it at the corner. There was a man sitting there. I'm going to describe him exactly as I saw him because the details matter. He was sitting with his back against the concrete wall, knees drawn up, in the narrow gap between the end of the shelving unit and the corner of the room. A space that was maybe 2 feet wide. I had not thought a grown man could fit comfortably into that space, and looking at him, he didn't look comfortable, but he was there. He was middle-aged, maybe 50, wearing work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, boots that were wet, soaked through, the way clothes get when someone has been caught out in heavy rain. His hair was wet too, plastered to his head. He had a beard, several days of growth, gray mixing with brown. He looked at the flashlight beam without flinching, without raising a hand to shield his eyes the way you'd expect from someone caught suddenly in bright light. He said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you." His voice was calm, ordinary. A man's voice, mid-Kansas accent, nothing unusual about it at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had been strange. Annie, beside me, said, "How did you get in here?" He said, "The door was open when the storm hit. I came down when I saw the cellar." I said, "The door was locked from the inside. I locked it myself." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I came down before you did." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. I came down before you did. We had gone down at 8:47, immediately upon the warning, and I had personally pulled the door shut and dropped the interior bar myself. I remembered doing it. I remembered the specific weight of the bar, the particular scrape of metal on metal, the satisfaction of the mechanism seating into place. There had been no one in the cellar when we came down. I would have seen him. The bare bulb illuminated the whole space. It was 8 feet by 10 feet. There was nowhere to hide that the light didn't reach, including the corner where he was now sitting. Unless he had been there the whole time and I simply hadn't seen him. Unless something else was happening that I did not have a framework for. I said, "There was no one here when we came in." He said, "I know it looks that way." I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Does it matter right now?" Annie's hand tightened on my arm. I said, "It matters to me." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at us in the flashlight beam, water still dripping from his soaked clothes onto the concrete floor. He said, "My name is Daniel." What followed was 11 hours in that cellar, and I'm going to walk you through it as carefully as I can, because every detail of those 11 hours is something I have replayed more times than I can count. I tried the door first. Within the first few minutes of finding Daniel in the corner, my instinct was to get out, to get above ground, into open air, away from a confined space with a stranger whose presence I could not explain. I went to the steel door and lifted the interior bar. The door would not open. I want to be clear. I had locked it myself with that bar, and lifting the bar should have released the mechanism entirely. It did not. I pushed against the door with my shoulder, with my full weight, and it did not move even slightly. Annie tried after me. Same result. I told myself it was storm debris, that something had fallen on top of the door during the tornado, weighing it down, blocking it from above, even with the interior mechanism released. This was, in fact, a plausible explanation, and one I clung to for most of the following hours. But it meant we were trapped in a small concrete room with a man named Daniel who claimed to have been there before we arrived, despite the room being empty and well lit when we entered. I picked up a length of pipe that we kept in the cellar for exactly this kind of unlikely circumstance, emergency tool, multi-purpose, the kind of practical thing you keep around on a farm. I held it, not raised, not threatening, but present. A clear signal. I said, "Daniel, I need you to explain what's happening, because right now none of this makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll tell you, but I need you to listen to the whole thing before you decide what you think of me. I'm going to tell you what Daniel told us in the order he told it, because the order mattered." He said his name was Daniel Pruitt. He said he had grown up on this farm, not our current farm exactly, but the land, the specific parcel, before it had been subdivided and sold decades ago. He said his family had farmed this ground from the 1920s until the 1970s, when economic pressure forced a sale, and the property had changed hands several times since, eventually becoming the configuration that Annie and I had bought 6 years prior. He said the storm cellar had been built by his father in 1958, after a tornado in 1956 had nearly killed the whole family while they sheltered in the farmhouse basement, which had partially collapsed. He said his father had built the cellar specifically because the farmhouse basement had proven unreliable, and he had built it well. Overbuilt it, actually, with more steel reinforcement and more depth than the building code of the time would have required. He said he had used that cellar dozens of times as a child and young man, sheltering from storms with his parents and his 2 sisters. He said that in May of 1974, 50 years before the night we were sitting in that cellar with him, there had been a tornado, a severe one, an F4 by the scale used at the time, and his family had gone to the cellar the way they always did. He said his father had gone last, the way he always did, making sure everyone else was inside first. He said the door had been struck by something during the storm, debris, probably part of the farmhouse roof, something heavy enough to jam the mechanism, and his father had not been able to get inside. He said his father had died outside that cellar door, 30 feet from his family, unable to get in, while the family inside heard him and could not open the door from their side either, because something heavy enough to disable the mechanism from outside had also prevented it from being lifted from inside. He said his family had been trapped in that cellar for 19 hours before help arrived and got the door open and found his father's body in the yard. He said he had never been the same after that. I sat with that story for a long moment, the flashlight still on him, Annie's hand still tight on my arm. I said, "That's a terrible thing to have happened, but it doesn't explain how you're here right now. It doesn't explain how you got into a locked cellar before we arrived." He looked at me. In the flashlight beam, his expression was something I have struggled to categorize since. Not threatening, not pleading, something more like exhausted patience. The expression of someone who has explained something many times and is not sure this time will be different. He said, "I come back every storm season. I've come back every year since 1974. I checked the door." He said, "I check that it opens from the inside. Every storm, every warning, I come and I make sure the door isn't going to do to anyone else what it did to my father." I said, "How? How do you do that?" "You'd be." I did the math in my head. If he had been a young man in 1974, even 20, even 25, he would be in his 70s now, not the 50 I'd estimated. He saw me doing the math. He said, "I know." I am not going to tell you that I believed him immediately. I want to be honest about the progression of my understanding, because I think the progression matters more than the conclusion. For the first several hours, I believed Daniel was a man in some kind of mental health crisis. Possibly someone with a genuine connection to the property's history. Possibly someone who had broken in during the chaos of the storm warning and concocted an elaborate story to explain his presence. Possibly someone dangerous who I needed to manage carefully until we could get out and get help. I kept the pipe close. I positioned myself between Daniel and Annie for most of the night. I asked him questions designed to test the consistency of his story, dates, names, details that a fabricated account would likely contradict itself on. He never contradicted himself, not once across 11 hours. He told us about his sisters, Carol and Jean, both gone now, he said, Carol in 2003 and Jean in 2019. He told us about the farmhouse that had stood on the property before ours, demolished in the 1980s when the new owners built the current house. He told us details about the land, a spring that used to run on the east side of the property before a previous owner diverted it for irrigation, the location of a family cemetery plot that had been on the original property but was now part of the neighboring farm due to a boundary adjustment in the 1960s. I checked some of these details later. All of them checked out through county records, through conversations with elderly neighbors who remembered the Pruitt family. The cemetery plot existed exactly where he said, on the neighboring property with 5 graves, one of them marked Walter Pruitt, died May 14, 1974, the same date as the storm he'd described. His father. Around 2 in the morning, after hours of conversation that had gradually shifted from suspicious interrogation to something stranger, something closer to a vigil, the 3 of us sitting in that small concrete room while Daniel told us about a family that had been farming this ground for 50 years before any of us arrived. I tried the door again. It opened. No resistance. No debris weight. The bar lifted. The door swung up easily. The cool, wet air of post-storm Kansas night flooding into the cellar. I looked at Daniel. He was watching the open door with an expression that I can only describe as relief. Not relief that he could now leave. He made no move toward the door. Relief in the way you feel relief when a thing you've been responsible for finally resolves correctly. He said, "It works. Good. It's supposed to work." I said, "Daniel, you should come out. Get warm." We can call someone, figure out. He shook his head. He said, I just needed to know the door would open. I said, why does it matter so much to you? He looked at me, and for the first time in 11 hours, something in his composure shifted. Something that had been held very carefully in place finally loosened. He said, because if the door doesn't work, somebody's family loses someone the way mine lost my father. And I check it every storm. I have checked it every single storm since 1974 because nobody else was going to, and because I couldn't let it happen to anyone else the way it happened to us. He said, I'm sorry I frightened you. I didn't mean to. I just needed to be here when the storm came, in case the door failed again. I climbed out of the cellar first. Annie came up behind me, Pepper at her heels. The farm was visibly damaged. A section of the barn roof torn away, debris scattered across the yard, but the house itself intact, the storm having passed close but not directly over us. I turned back to help Daniel up. The cellar was empty. I want to be precise about this. I had turned to offer my hand, expecting him to be at the base of the steps where he'd been standing a moment before. The space was empty. No movement, no sound, no indication that anyone had gone anywhere. Simply the absence of a person who had been present a moment before. I went back down the steps, checked the corner where I'd first found him, checked behind the shelving, checked every inch of that 8x10 room. Empty. Annie called down to me, asking what was wrong. I came back up and told her, and we stood in the wrecked yard at 3 in the morning and looked at each other and didn't fully have words for what had just happened to us. I spent the following weeks researching what Daniel had told us. I want to walk you through what I found, because the research is what eventually allowed me to understand the 11 hours we'd spent in that cellar. Walter Pruitt died on May 14, 1974, on the property that is now our farm. County records confirmed the death, listed as accidental, weather-related. The local newspaper from that week, I found it on microfilm at the county library, ran a short article about a tornado that had struck the area and a brief mention, almost an afterthought, that one local farmer had died in the storm, found outside his family's storm shelter. I found an obituary for Walter Pruitt, survived by his wife and 3 children, Daniel, Carol, and Jean. I found Carol Pruitt's obituary from 2003. I found Jean Pruitt's from 2019. I could not find an obituary for Daniel Pruitt. I found, eventually, through a County Historical Society volunteer who remembered the family, that Daniel Pruitt had left the area shortly after his father's death, in his early 20s at the time, and had not been heard from by anyone in the community since. The volunteer, an elderly woman who had gone to school with Carol, said the general understanding had always been that Daniel had simply moved away, the way young people did, and lost touch. She said no one had ever confirmed where he'd gone. She said some people in town had wondered, over the years, whether he was even still alive. I have thought about this for 4 years, and I have arrived at an understanding that I cannot prove and that I offer to you the way Daniel offered his story to me, asking you to listen to the whole thing before you decide what you think of it. I believe that Daniel Pruitt has been checking that storm cellar door every storm season since 1974. I believe that whatever form that checking takes, whether it is the literal continued existence of a man who would now be in his 70s, living some kind of life we know nothing about, returning to the property out of an obsessive unresolved grief, or whether it is something else, something that does not fit into the category of living human being at all, I believe his purpose was exactly what he told us it was. Making sure the door works. Making sure no one else's family loses a father the way his family lost theirs. I believe that for one night, 50 years after the worst night of his life, he needed us to understand why he was there. And I believe that once he told us, Once the door had opened and the storm had passed and his purpose for that night was complete, he was able to leave in whatever way it is that he leaves. I don't think he'll be back next storm season to check on us specifically. I think he checks every storm cellar on this stretch of ground that his family once farmed, the way a man checks on something he's responsible for indefinitely until the responsibility is no longer needed. I leave the cellar door slightly propped now, just an inch, with a wedge that won't compromise the seal but ensures nothing can jam the mechanism from outside. I don't know if that matters to him. I do it anyway. Some debts, once you understand them, you find ways to honor even when you don't fully understand who you're honoring them for. That's the story. 11 hours in a storm cellar. A man who shouldn't have been there. A grief 50 years old that turned into a vigil that turned into a kind of protection that has probably saved lives we'll never know about. If the story kept you on the edge of your seat, if you were holding your breath right along with me in that cellar, then this channel is exactly where you should be. Subscribe right now. I tell stories like this one regularly, and the next one might be the one that gets under your skin even more than this one did. Hit the bell too so you don't miss it. Hit like. I know I ask every time, but it matters every time. The algorithm decides who sees stories like this one, and your like is a vote that says this story deserves an audience. And leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever sheltered from a storm. Tell me if you've ever been somewhere you couldn't explain how you got there or who was there with you. Tell me if your family has a story like Walter Pruitt's, a grief that turned into something that watches over the people who came after. I read every single comment. Daniel checks the doors. I check the comments. We all have our way of making sure the people who matter to us get out safe. See you on the next story.